Welcome to the R3 podcast. I'm your host, Elliot Robinson. And I know that I've not been visiting with you for quite some time, and it's because I've been watching how things have unfolded, and pretty much they have been following Project 2025 playbook step by step. There have been a lot of things that have been distractions. There have been a lot of things that have been for clicks and bits. But my focus has been looking at what's happening with overthrowing basically state governance. And so I want to do a quick recap of two previous podcasts to show that there's been some movement as it relates to things that we've already spoken about, and then looking at what we can do moving forward. So if we remember, and if you haven't had an opportunity to listen, I would strongly suggest that you listen to two previous podcasts that I came out with. May the 1st is Trump flirting with martial law. And then June the 9th is California, the tipping point. What's really important in that May 1st podcast was looking and examining one of the executive orders put out by the Trump administration. This one was strengthening and unleashing America's law enforcement to pursue criminals and protect innocent citizens. In that episode, we talked a lot about the Homeland Security Task Force mechanism. Yep, I know that's ringing in your ears because we saw that unfold in the District of Columbia. That task force mechanism sits underneath the executive branch, as we now know, and their goal is to place a task force in every state in the country, and as we also now know, jurisdiction being the District of Columbia. And in those task force, the federal military, state, and local law enforcement agencies will work, we can say as one, but really what will happen is the state and local law enforcement will work under the oversight of federal enforcement mechanisms, we'll put it that way. And so in that podcast, I talked also about inviting military presence into the various states in order to activate that task force mechanism. We, at the time, in talking about this, the thought was that somehow they would try to find a workaround by inviting the U.S. military into these spaces. And so the question was, can a state invite the U.S. military into that state to serve any type of enforcement function? Well, the reality is that is simply unconstitutional. We talked also a little bit about what happens when there is no when there is no unrest. And when there isn't unrest, the first line of defense, the National Guard, is not applicable. So what happened in California was they got around that by simply creating a form of unrest, as it were, under the guise of a few protests that were happening for immigration, but they used that as a catalyst for basically forcing the National Guard to come in and to protect ICE agents as they were doing their job. Again, we have to remember their goal is to have militarized outposts in all 50 states and the District of Columbia as a way to basically stamp out uprisings, to stamp out any type of protest against the impact of the policies of this particular administration. There was also within that particular executive order a promise of qualified immunity for law enforcement. We have not seen that activated as of yet. However, I would imagine that as it moves on as a chip or as an enticement, as a carrot, they may dangle that back out again under the guise of being able to offer it as a subsidiary of a federal agency. At the state and local level, somehow being, since they're part of the task force, they would be usurped, or they would be basically taken up underneath the umbrella of the federal, and then they would be able to try to offer federal immunity. Also discussed that's where big law would come in, the law firms finding ways to litigate this if they just weren't able to make this come to fruition. What is interesting is you don't hear as much of them talk about qualified immunity as they did before. In that also, executive order, and we're beginning to see how this piece plays out as they're trying to shove down our throats a crime bill. They talked about enemies of the state, whomever they believe are enemies of the state are individuals that they at the federal level would have the ability to go after. extradition of those individuals for state and local crimes by federal officials. That's a part of that executive order. Or perhaps gangs who have affiliations in other countries. We saw that recently with the bombing of the boat, or the alleged bombing of the boat, off the coast of Venezuela. And so whomever they consider gangs, they would then consider enemies of the state. And so what we're looking at, the issue that some states have been looking to, some have been looking to outright, obviously, stop. Some are looking to appease and to balance, is loss of control. And so you have loss of control of your state law enforcement apparatus, while others are balancing what they perceive to be the need to show loyalty to this current administration. So some states have offered and lent their National Guard to the DC occupation. Others have pledged their National Guard to assist at the local level with ICE enforcement in places like the state of Georgia, where I think they offered up 75 National Guardsmen or National Guards persons. And so that was something that we discussed, that executive order, which is now being brought to activation. On June the 9th, on the podcast is California, the Tipping Point, we talked a little bit about, obviously, Project 2025, but California being the federal deployment test case. And so sending in the National Guard under the guise of protecting federal property, again, by any means necessary, they were going to look to push the envelope. Also, as we had already talked about, California was one of the many foils of the GOP talking points for the last probably 12 years, creating them and making them an enemy of the people. The same with Chicago, the same with Baltimore. What do these jurisdictions and what do these locations have in common? Those are places that this administration has been targeting because they have been talked up enough that they feel their base would be okay with them sending federal troops into those jurisdictions. And so in that, going back to that podcast, the question that we had was, will we allow the federal government to take federal control over states? Again, going back to the goal of a hub in every state. They want to flatten everything out. They want to have a heavy hand over every single state so that there cannot be opposition rising up against what's happening at the federal, really at the executive branch level. Well, the question was always, well, why would a GOP-led state trust this administration? Well, from the beginning, there have been promises of block grants that they have not gotten thus far, but grants that they, I guess, still believe will be coming, even though in their state, they are seeing the impact of federal resources eroded away, programs cut, money slashed. There is still this hope, I would imagine, that if they genuflect enough and kiss the ring enough, funds will be released. Why did they want block grant money? Because they were probably intending to skim some money for themselves, since at the federal level, the distribution of a grant through a grant-making mechanism, gratuities are allowable. And so I would imagine that some states have impacted similar legislation so that if you are in on the granting of funds, you would then be able to skim. You also would be able to use those grant block monies for any legal purpose. Well, the grant block money hasn't come. And so right now, I think some states, at least at the lower levels, are looking and wondering what have they gotten themselves into. Others are 10 toes down because they have figured out for themselves at the very top of the food chain other ways to receive funds, whether it's in support of what's happening in the state of Israel, whether it's support of what's happening in terms of larger government expenditure and contracts where they find themselves to be able to skim off of that, or whether it's the money that they're making through crypto or through insider trading. And so that's how some states are operating in this particular environment. Now, if we allowed the feds, and we talked about this, if we allowed the feds to take over states, who is to believe that the states would continue to have control over the money? And the reality is there are strings attached. And as we have seen currently, there have been strings attached to anything that comes to the states. And so states are already seeing money that has already been allocated to them by Congress legally has been and is being withheld. And yet they still continue to go along on this particular ride. And so the question was, at what point is the tipping point in this arrangement going to meet a breaking point for the country? If you're going to usurp a state's police power, then basically you're usurping the power of that entity to govern itself. And I do believe that is part of a reason why some of these GOP states are running to just go ahead and lend out some of their own National Guards people in support of this agenda, because they don't want to end up on the hit list. Again, case in point, the state of Georgia giving a 75 guardsmen, National Guardsmen allocation, then turning around and participating in one of the worst raids in the history of this country of the Hyundai plant. Make it make sense. The largest single, that particular plant was going to be the largest single investment in the state of Georgia in the history of the state. But in order to kiss the ring, they participated and allowed that to happen on soil in the state of Georgia. Now there is an international economic crisis between the United States and South Korea. The plan, again, as we have said, is to federalize, to move from state to state to state. This will not end with immigrants. As we have already seen, they have pivoted. And they are also looking at incarcerating, as the president has said, black and brown children, making it exceedingly clear. A 30 plus count felon talking about other children, about children who are not able to be redeemed or repaired or to be rehabilitated. Isn't that amazing? A man whose entire life has been nothing but crime, housing discrimination, racial discrimination, sexual assault, alleged pedophilia, 36 counts of felony, cannot operate a business in the state of New York. And yet he is the arbiter of who can and cannot be rehabilitated. It is literally insane. So what we're looking at as they make the shift now to U.S. citizens who are black and brown, and clearly black and brown children are their one of their targets, we have to remember that there are also alternative forms of incarceration that were funded in the big, beautiful bill. And so that is something that these threats are not idle threats in terms of coming after black and brown children. And so we have to be mindful of that. When we're looking at how the language, the rhetoric, the ways in which they have embedded themselves within local and state law enforcement mechanisms, when we look at what happened with the DC occupation, and that's what we can call it, if we keep in mind this simple fact, it can help us to better understand not only what is happening, but what will happen next, as it relates to, in particular, to how they want to roll out, how they are rolling out Project 2025. And it is simply this: think more RICO than Third Reich, more RICO than Third Reich, more racketeering than Third Reich. Third Reich is the dressing, racketeering is the mechanism. And I think if we think about it from that perspective, it'll make more sense in our American context. We keep talking about fascism, and that is what it can be in its fullness. But if we think about it from the perspective of racketeering, we can have a better idea of what this is actually how this is playing out in our context. It will end up being defined down the road as a fascist state if we allow it. But I think if we look at it as how are they operating, they're taking away something from people and then making them pay to get it back. That's extortion. In its purest form, they're taking, for example, in DC, they took away their right to be able to enforce laws on their own. And then Bowser had to cut a deal. And in the deal, she championed the fact that law enforcement won't have their faces covered. Law enforcement will have to be able to clearly display who they are on their gear. That's the law. That's the law. She didn't get anything. What she did was she made them do what they were supposed to do legally, but in return, she gave up so much. And so what you're doing is you're having them consistently, persistently run a racketeering scheme. And so when we look at what happened with the DC occupation, their mentality is we're just going to take this. We're taking it. And there's nothing you can do about it. And so that was the test case for one, how to move into a jurisdiction. And we know DC is very different from most states, well, from all the states, in that the federal government does have a hand in the apparatus and the ways in which DC operates. Absolutely. But it was a test case on how to embed and how to interact with local law enforcement using ICE agents. And for some jurisdictions, even with the FBI, although they are not as keen on FBI, but because they are a little more of an independent agency, but definitely ICE, also for some entities, DEA, but definitely how ICE works in an embedded way with state and local officials. DC, you already had that apparatus in place. And so in some respects, it wasn't a difficult transition. What made it more difficult was one, the mission that they were putting forth, and two, the presence of the National Guard and the presence of a weaponized National Guard. And so those are the pieces that they are testing out to see what will that look like when we take over. At least that's how it is in their mindset. And so in the DC occupation, they were also forcing a heavy hand to see if there would be a counter pressure. Unfortunately, the mayor, she felt like she was not in a position to fight back. They were already withholding the budget, significant parts of the DC budget. And I'm sure in her mind, if she just allowed them access, then eventually there would be some form of relief. And we know that it's set to run out. I believe it's today. But something that we have to look at when we talk about this is definitely a racketeering operation in some respects is simply this. What did he call for during the occupation? He called for Congress to pass the big beautification bill, where basically the executive branch would be given $1 billion to do what? To beautify DC, to put some grass in some of the parks. But we know what parks those are going to be. $1 billion with a B to do some beautification in DC. Billion with a B. And then he calls out Clark Construction as his preferred company to be able to be the ones to implement whatever beautification there is. He's mentioned Clark Construction several times, which means that he obviously has quite an in with them. We also know that gratuities are allowed. And so whatever contracts go to Clark Construction, he will be able to claw back a part of that as a gratuity, since that is legal per the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Like I said, if we look at it through the lens of RICO, these things, at least from his end, make a lot of sense. Now, in implementing the National Guard and using them, he got around the oath, obviously, and the issue of U.S. soldiers being used against U.S. civilians. You still have the slippery slope in that the National Guard's mission is not law enforcement, but is support at the state level. And so that, of course, is their current use is by law illegal, but we know that pretty much whatever they desire to do, they are going to let them do, which is one of the most troubling pieces of this entire takeover by this particular administration, that the other two branches of government has simply just laid down and allowed them to break the law whenever they feel like it. Now, we know that there have been hints, strong hints, at sending in ICE in various other cities. We have obviously Chicago, Baltimore. They mentioned New York, San Francisco, Oakland. Going into New York, basically in an attempt, I would imagine, to also influence the mayoral race. which would impact a lot of individuals who have close ties with the current administration. Chicago, because Chicago has been a foil of the GOP forever, and Baltimore, because the reality is proximity. Basically, there is a lot of federal government apparatus. We have Air Force, we have military bases in the state of Maryland. And so sadly, that would be contentious. But from a logistics perspective, it would be rather easy for them to deploy military in some form in the city of Baltimore. So those are ones that we're looking at. Obviously, San Francisco and Oakland would be an extension of the work that they're already doing in LA. So we have to really take these things seriously, and I'm sure that we are, but realizing that they're also illegal. They are illegal, and what has happened is they have somewhat shown their hand during the DC takeover. How did they do that? Well, they've been, in terms of, at one point in one of the press conferences, they were mentioning the fact that they wanted to have the federal government infuse itself into arrest in the District of Columbia and to bring federal charges wherever possible. And we saw that happen. They began to bring federal charges. They also began to bring charges that were citations, and this is the MPD, that were citations like fare jumping, and trying to charge them as misdemeanors. The greater concern that we have was they're giving basically the charge, the mandate for ICE and for other federal agencies who were in the District of Columbia to find reasons to also bring federal charges for things that were local offenses, if they were even in fact offenses. Why is that important? Because as I mentioned earlier, in the big beautiful bill, there's a huge amount of money set aside for alternative forms of incarceration. That could be ankle monitoring, which is probably going to be the primary form that they're going to use. But obviously you just have also full on incarceration. Every time you turn around, there's a state that is lining up to build an ICE detention center in their state. And that is one of the ways in which I believe there is some skimmability by governors in those particular states. But they're also looking at ways to manufacture deporting people or bringing them under federal control, which means that now they have a criminal labor workforce. This is not a far-fetched or even an untested mandate. The state of Alabama makes I think it's over $900 million from incarcerated labor. And so at the federal level, I believe a part of the reason why we see so many corporations, other than fear of tariffs, lining up to be in agreement with this administration is at the federal level, they would love to be able to have more individuals who would be able to work for them at a much cheaper rate now that immigrant labor is basically being run out of the country. Because these companies still need individuals to do this work. They still don't want to pay prevailing wages. So where are these workers going to come from? Well, they're going to come from individuals who've been incarcerated, who have charges of one sort or another that will then be under federal control. The federal government will then be able to basically farm them out. And so what I believe what we'll end up seeing is some form of non-incarcerated forced labor. And so that is something that is sadly, I believe, on the horizon, and that we have to be mindful of as the federal government attempts to infuse itself at the state level in every single state in their law enforcement apparatus with the charge of bringing federal charges wherever possible. Now, we know from a legal perspective, it is incredibly narrow what would rise to the level of a federal charge, unless, of course, you change the crime bill or you create a crime bill that makes things that are state and local now federal. And so that is the danger of what could be on the horizon as they are trying to now pump up and promote creating a new crime bill. The new crime bill's job is going to be to take state and federal charges that would normally fall and create nebulous language that would allow them to charge people at the federal level for things that are not federal crimes, things that are not crimes that impact across state lines, things that are crimes. And it would probably be in part of expanding greatly the idea of what it means to be in a gang, expand greatly what it means to participate in an activity that is interstate, that impacts between multiple states, to expand what it means probably to be a traitor, as it were, if to speak out against, to be in opposition to administration. So those are the types of things that I expect to see in these various drafts of a crime bill that's probably already been written by the Heritage Foundation, but of a crime related bill. And so that's something that we need to look at as well. I would suggest that we really spend time, as I've said in previous podcasts, know your Second Amendment rights. Know what they are in your state, your jurisdiction, because things are getting very, very troublesome. And so we know for a fact that they have pretty much mechanized a large part of what they want to do. They have already cut pretty much all funding sources to individuals who need them at the federal level. And whether that's Medicaid, whether that's Medicare, whether that's Veteran Affairs, whether that's gutting the Department of Education, whether that is cutting food assistance, they have gutted what the purpose of a government really is. They have basically gutted our public health system and put in a bunch of quacks. And so, individuals become sick. They have gutted food safety. So we are in a perilous stage. And so what they have now done, and we're also not going to speak about the fact that they have just had an incredible transfer of wealth and continuing to transfer federal funds in just massive numbers to contractors who are friends of the administration. And so we've seen that shift. We've also seen the impact it's having on our farmers and the impact of tariffs, rising costs just at an astronomical level. We've seen the impact of unemployment, in particular in certain communities hit harder than others, including Black women who have been hit extremely hard with unemployment numbers. We've also seen housing, where there are, in last count, 500,000 more homes on the market than there are buyers to purchase them. This is nationwide. And so we are definitely moving towards a recession or a recession period. We also have basically chilled labor markets, especially in particular sectors like in agriculture, obviously in our restaurant industries, obviously in our food industries. We have to look at also in factories, in those industries, in the gig economy. So, there has been incredible pressure placed on the economic engines in this country. And so what happens when all of these things are taking place? There's incredible tension. And now that individuals are also beginning to realize that they have been duped by this administration, there is anger, there's angst. What does the administration do? In order to get people not looking at them, they have pivoted, they have shifted, and they have gone full-born white supremacists, super uber racist. They're wide open. And so this next phase is what I'm calling the Great Distraction. And what they're relying on is America's great obsession with unbridled racism and sexism. And that can be shown in the comments of the current president on even just as recently as yesterday, in which he said, if a man and a woman, if a husband and a wife, and as he said, they're getting into a spat, that's not the police's business. So what he's saying is, husbands, if you beat your wives, they shouldn't. That's not a crime. That's not something that the police should even bother themselves with. A man and a woman should be able to get into a fight in their home. And we know in most of those instances, probably 99.9%, the man is going to win the fight. It's going to be a domestic violence situation. And the president of the United States of America said the police shouldn't be involved. It's just a spat. And so now they are going full blast, full on racism, sexism, misogyny, because their hope is they will be able to rise up a base of white men who will say, it's okay. Racism is enough for me. And they're banking on this. They are 10 toes down in this belief that racism will be enough. And on my next podcast, I'll talk about this idea of racism being enough. But I don't want to get too deep into it today, but we will talk about it because this is the next phase that we're moving to, especially as they're trying to push the crime bill. So let's just continue to stay vigilant, continue to realize that this next phase will be incredibly challenging. It will be painful, but we have to continue to persist and continue to fight for what we know to be true. And if we want to keep this country as a democracy, even though it's feeling more and more every day like it is not that, there is still hope. And so, again, let's just keep fighting and keep pressing, keep reading the tea leaves of what's happening, and realize that this is not checkmate at this point. It's looking like the board is getting clear, but we're still not at checkmate. And so just continue to fight, stay vigilant, do not fret, do not be upset, but know that there is still work to be done. And next episode, I will talk a little bit about some more things that we can do to keep ourselves empowered and to keep ourselves emboldened during this time. Reverend Dr. Elliot Robinson with the R3 Podcast. Until next time, take care and God bless.